It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of your Real Estate Podcast right around Australia as we cover off all of your property news. You can hear us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeartRadio. It is a Monday morning back from a crazy shopping weekend around Australia where the cash register was ringing red hot, and it's the 22nd day of December, getting very, very close to the big day. And if you were wanting to be in before Christmas and you have managed to achieve that, hey, congratulations to you. It's quite the deal to be in your new home before you start unwrapping those Christmas presents in a couple of days' time. And coming up next, we are going all the way back to February of this year for a look back through the real estate time tunnel. That is next.
The Real Estate Podcast wishes you and your family a fantastic Christmas break and a happy new year ahead.
Yeah, so there are unfortunately particularly first home buyers who brought at the height of the market. Through the Crown and the Council came up with a buyout scheme. And so if you went through that process and were categorised as a Category 3, which is for a buyout, the Council would offer you a buyout for that property at the market rate the day before the flood in 2023. So if you had brought at the height of the market, like many of these first home buyers had, they were stuck in negative equity. And so they either have an offer on the table or they've accepted that offer. And essentially, you are correct that they will end up with a mortgage debt on a property that the council now owns.
As I said, they can't live in their properties, the amount of time for resolution. Now, this can be the difference between having a breakdown and not having a breakdown with the internal stress that people are under. Now, often this happens to younger people, as we've mentioned, with young children. Their world absolutely changes within this flash flooding event. How much of that have you actually seen, just in terms of the stress load?
One of the heartbreaking things to have witnessed over the last 2 years has been seeing people under incredible emotional, financial and mental stress. We would hear countless stories of people who, anytime it looked like it was going to rain, had their go bag ready to go with life jackets ready to go. We would hear stories of families, first home buyers, young family in the local school, they're invested in the local community, having to move out of that community, and then all of the financial stresses and loads on top of that. I mean, one of the things that people had is they were paying rates on properties they couldn't live in. So one of the things we advocated for was, well, if they can't live on these properties, they shouldn't be paying rates. So we advocated for that and we got rates relief. This is one of the unseen tolls that this has, that these ever-increasing weather events are having on people, is the emotional toll, the mental toll that isn't just for the lifetime of the event, but it continues. I mean, just recently we had the 2-year anniversary of the flood. And for me, I'm out of the situation. My family and I were able to get out of our flooded home and move into another home. But it brought up a whole lot of memories that I thought were long buried. And I think my experience is like many that have been impacted by weather events. It is more than the event itself. It leaves its mark for years to come.
Yes, that whole idea of when it rains, you're inside the house with your go bag thinking, do I have to evacuate? I mean, that is just, and not being able to sleep, of course, which is another problem. Now, I've got to ask you this question, especially for people thinking of buying in Australia or anywhere for that matter, and that is where there's been a flood and you hear these various people saying, oh, don't worry about that. That was just a 1 in a 100-year flood. No worries at all. And it's a little bit like betting on the Melbourne Cup. Nobody truly knows the outcome.
We did all our research, and the information that we were told is that it would be a 1 in 100-year flood and that the level of water would just be at the bottom of our property. It was 6 feet at the bottom, over 6 feet at the bottom of our property for the first flood. And the second flood, it was higher again. So you can do all the research and all the due diligence that you can, and there still can be a not so positive outcome. And I think that people who've gone through these flooding events or other weather events that have involved their property and their home, it's not just bricks and mortar, it's their home. I think to be able to give yourself some grace in that, I did all of my due diligence and still this happened. We can be as wise as we can be and still things don't always play out.
Now, the Perth median house price, wow, look at that, surpassed $900,000, which means that it's on track to hit $1 million later this year. Talk about the strong population growth, of course, also the limited housing supply, rising demand. That is something that we've talked about. It's just not slowing down and, you put your foot on it. It is this very strong, popular area now into those eastern corridors that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think what it is we have beautiful climate, we've got an amazing array of amenities, etc. available, and we're very secluded. And the fact that we're secluded has made us become the poor cousin, so to speak, within the Australian economy. But that's actually changed a lot, especially after COVID, and we see people coming and flooding to Perth. And I think the reason we're seeing things start to rise and we're approaching what I believe is our first boom in a very long time is because we're not affected by the commodity sector at the moment. While that's down, we don't have any major projects finishing. We don't see any major, large scales of people ready to vacate our western suburbs. What we see is more people actually wanting to live here, and there are less homes for sale right now than there were this time last year, and yet we still didn't hit our targets of what we should have, and I don't think we can, and so I don't see this slowing down in any way, shape or form.
Now, you've said that people will go into a shared rental and sign up for, one of these 1 or 2 year leases with people that they don't even know. But when it comes to buying property with somebody that they do know, like a brother, a sister or a mate, they don't do it. So what's going on there in the mindset, do you think?
I think we're so affected to think that property investment is out of reach. And so it doesn't even cross our mind. The idea, everyone thinks that they need to save a huge deposit. Everybody believes they need to do all of these factors. And so they don't do anything. Yet when they're looking for a house, rather than seeing what are the ways or the non-traditional ways to get into property ownership now, what's the soonest that I can get in, they'll rather jump in with a bunch of random people and live there. And everyone's had a roommate that they hated. Everyone's had someone who's horrible from that. So you might argue with your uncle, your brother, your cousin, your mate, but better off to be making money and putting yourself in a position of home ownership than just trying to rent a property. And why not? Why not look to multi-generational living? Why not look to multi-friendship aspects or find somebody? The government tried this in a small way a few years ago, but I think it's something, I really believe it's one of the only options for a lot of people now because they are priced out of the market. And it's not that the market's not affordable, it's just that affordable range has shifted and it's never going to come down. Like you said, the affordability is up between 8 to 900,000, average price for a home.
The rising prices, single buyers now need an income of $130,000 to secure a home. And that's quite a long way away from $55,000 that was required in just 2020. Man, has that moved?
Absolutely. You could buy a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in 2020, single story, on say a 350 square metre block for around the 300 to 350,000, and a $55,000 income would have secured that. Nowadays, you need to be earning at least $130,000 as a single, or as a couple, probably closer to $170,000, especially if you've got kids. The problem is people don't just have their income. And every time I hear somebody say that they can't get into a home of their own, that they can't save, it's generally because we're spending. We spend every little cent that we have. Some places right now the rent has definitely gone up, and that puts a hinder in it. But again, it comes down to the ability of people to look at what the other options are. If you could have bought a house for $55,000 4 years ago, obviously you should have. But in the last 4 years, we've seen the median house price rise, and in fact, more than double what it was.
I think real estate has incredible opportunities, but I think that there is a misconception about how quickly or potentially easily people can get to that top percentile of agents operating. The majority of agents, it takes them a lot longer than I think what they anticipate to get their momentum going. So you've got to learn the right habits. You've got to set yourself up correctly from the beginning if you're going into sales. And then you've got to build, a digital footprint. You've got to get to know the community. You've got to learn how to transact and negotiate. So there's quite a lead time. And the ones who do exceptionally well, I guess I don't want to say less common, but there are quite a few who don't quite get to where they think it's going to be. I think it looks quite glamorous from the outside. It's a bit harder than I think what it looks like for those coming in.
When it comes to sales, you can never, ever pick who is going to make a great salesperson. It's the most unlikeliest of person. Sometimes they come through and you go, wow, where did that come from? I did not see that coming.
Yeah, and I think the consumer has changed. I think that now what they really want is someone who's authentic, who they can find easily, but someone who they can really relate to and who can demonstrate how they're going to get a better result for them. So I think it went through a stage where it was all about digital, but I think it's really coming back to that necessity to have the balance of being able to interact with people, sit down around the table, the old school real estate supported by the new way of the digital technology there.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of actually talking about those two areas cross-pollinating with each other. And I would also say that if you're thinking about going into real estate, you really need to look at your social media because, as Charlotte just said, it's about being authentic. And if you're represented on your social media channels as maybe a little bit of chest beating, maybe look at me, look at me, look at me, it does not fly when people are looking at engaging a real estate agent. Not unless you are in the 1% where people just look at the absolute mass coverage that this person has, and almost by default, they might not like that person, but they sign up to that person anyway.
Yeah, I think that ego marketing is never really very popular. And I think as real estate agents, we like to talk about this is what we did, this is what we did. But ultimately, you've got to really understand the demographic that you're operating within. If you're in a community, let's say you're in a regional area, it doesn't go well in communities like that where they don't want to see that ego marketing. They want to know what you're doing with the local schools or how are you supporting the community. What the consumer wants to know is, do they like you? Can they trust you? Do they truly believe that you are a good human who's going to get them a great result? And if they do, and they can find you through your digital footprint, you've got a much greater opportunity of being successful. So I think when you're using social media or creating a digital footprint, you have to be true to who you are. If you try and be something else and you try and replicate what someone else is doing, you don't have a point of difference. So I think coming back to that authentic piece, which I'm very big on, authenticity is what's going to get you in the door and it's going to get you the deal, because there's only one person who can be you around that dining room table when you're listing the home.
And for 2025, when you guys did that, was there anything a little bit different maybe from when you sat down at the start of 2023? Is anything a little bit different? I guess it would be, right, with these interest rate cuts that are coming.
Yes, and I think the thing is, if you think back to last year, everyone was expecting that we would have seen a rate cut, and it didn't come. It came in many other economies, but not here in Australia. So for us, one of the big shifts has been, one, the fact that rate cuts are likely to come a bit later than what we were thinking early last year, but also, two, that we're not likely to see many rate cuts. So I said before, just 2 25 basis point cuts this year. That goes down to a few things. One is the resilience in the labour market. We know the labour market continues to be really strong at the moment. The unemployment rate's very low by historical standards at 4%. And people are continuing to get jobs. So that's a big win for the RBA in many ways, because they have talked a lot about walking this narrow path where they're trying to get inflation down, but also ensure that people keep their jobs. And they have seemed to walk that narrow path reasonably well. The other thing too is that we've got a range of cost of living relief that's been in effect for about 6 months now, the most notable being the stage 3 tax cuts, of course. And that is flowing through into a modest recovery in household spending. So you've got people spending a bit more now, albeit they're still not spending a lot, but spending growth is continuing to improve. And we think that that will be a trend that continues in 2025, and people are in their jobs. So ultimately, that does suggest that the RBA, when it does start cutting rates, it's really going to be tinkering rates, moving back to what we as economists call the neutral interest rate, that neither stimulates the economy nor causes it to contract.
Yeah, and in terms of those CPI numbers, Australia's underlying inflation rate has dropped to that 3.2% that you mentioned. It is the lowest in 3 years. And I guess when that happens, it does spark these discussions about a potential rate cut in the coming month or so. And this decrease does strengthen the RBA case for easing interest rates. Is that kind of fair to say that?
I think that's right. I mean, our view at ANZ is that we're going to see a rate cut in February. Now, as you said, trim mean inflation, which is the RBA's preferred measure of inflation because it strips out all that volatility and looks at the underlying trend in inflation. That came in at 3.2%, which was below the RBA's forecast of 3.4%. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but the fact that inflation looks like it is on that track back towards target, and if you look at what we call the inflation pulse, so it's the 6-month annualized measure of inflation, that is annualizing within the RBA's target band. So in other words, that inflation pulse does suggest like things are on the right track. And Michelle Bullock has said several times that the RBA don't actually need inflation within its target band before it starts cutting. But what they do need to feel is that inflation is going to get to target and importantly actually stay there. So it'll be a sustainable return to target. And the fact that measures like that inflation pulse are within the RBA's target band does give us quite a bit of confidence that the RBA will cut rates.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.